I'm good. I'm so excited for this conversation all about gray divorce, which is divorce when you're 50 plus. And, I think people are usually really surprised to learn that that demographic really is the highest demographic going through divorce. And that can be for a myriad of reasons. And we'll kind of dive into that. But I
Sure.
just kind of want to set things up really quickly, introduce you properly, and then I'll just roll into my questions. And then if anybody has a question, feel free to drop it in the comments. I'll make sure to get to it immediately after I ask. And just if you can only make it for part of this conversation, it's going to be posted immediately after on my Instagram page and my blog, and I'll be tagging Jorin in it. So with that, thank you for joining me today.
Sure.
Jorin Rubin is a Michigan-based divorce and family law attorney, also criminal, and she is a co-owner of Rubin Frampton Law Offices. Since opening her own office in 2002, she's focused much of her practice on divorce, child custody, and spousal support matters, in addition to criminal defense. So, what I love about your presence on social media, Jorin, when we connected years ago when I first started working in this niche, is your account, and especially your TikTok account, you're also here on Instagram, is filled with all of these great tips from a divorce
Right.
attorney. And that's the name of her account as
Right.
well. And I just find all of your information so incredibly helpful. And the fact that you're just kind of giving it out there, it's not legal advice, but it's little tips and tools to prepare you for the process. So with that, I'm going to just jump
Sure.
into it. So look, you're seeing a lot more gray divorces these days, right? I know with my clients, it's a lot more people who are 40 up that I'm helping prepare. What special challenges do you find your clients over 50 face when they're ending a long-term marriage? Those challenges that maybe a younger couple doesn't face.
Well, I think the main issue is on employment usually because when you're in your 50s, if you have been employed throughout your marriage, you're in a much more secure mentally and financially place than someone, say, who was home raising the children. So I feel like, people, they wait till their kids get into college, let's say, before now you're home alone with your spouse and you're like, oh, maybe this isn't the way I want to finish up things. So, uh, where I find the difficulty really for older people who just have been out of the workplace and with technology and just not going someplace every day is very, very challenging for people. That if maybe they're not getting the hugest settlement, or it's a modest settlement and they're thinking, oh boy, I gotta go for 30, 40 more years with not a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
So
No, definitely financial fears are one of the biggest triggers that people going through a divorce have to kind of face. That's something I deal with clients on all the time. And what you're talking about having perhaps one spouse who's been out of the workforce, and whether they've been a primary parent or working inside of the home in other ways, it is really scary when you get to the point where you're 45 plus and you're realizing, wait a minute, I need to start planning for retirement. And maybe you hadn't done that during the course of your marriage. And we're going to kind of get into that hurdle. And so in addition to not only while you're doing the asset division, but as you said, if you've been out of the workforce, it's a great time to start investing in yourself. And I know that brings up a lot of fear. What can I do? Where's my place now? But even just identifying areas where you're talented in, whether it's childcare or whether you had a career that you had prior to marriage, whatever it is, focus on something that could bring you not only joy but money as you're moving forward, so you feel a little more in control of the process. Well, let's kind of dive into that retirement.
okay.
How does divorcing after 50 really shake up somebody's like social security benefits and retirement accounts? And are there protection strategies that people don't know about? I mean, and I would say, Jordan, actually, if you could answer this in a way that whether you're the person with the retirement accounts or you're the person without as
Okay.
well.
Okay, let me just break it down a little bit because Social Security is its own animal. And presuming there aren't any dramatic changes, I can tell you how it's been going for the last 50 years, which is that is not actually totally affected by divorce as much as retirement accounts. So on the Social Security side, you are entitled to 50% of your ex-spouse's Social Security benefit or yours, whichever's higher, if you're the right age, which is at least 62, but or maybe it's 63 now,
Mhm.
um, and you're not married, and you were married for 10 years. So that's important, and that doesn't take away from your ex-spouse's retirement if you get half of what their equivalent would be. So that's that's like a blanket statement, and that's how it works right now. I mean, I'm just nervous. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, right? But that is so that's regardless
Mhm.
of your status or whether, because if you're the non-worker and you haven't contributed to Social Security, or you're going to start contributing in your 40s or 50s, you may still have much less than someone who's
Yeah.
made more than say 138,000, which is the maximum, and then that person is going to be getting over $4,000 a month.
Mhm.
So that's Social Security. As far as retirement, that's going to be 50% of the marital portion. There's
Mhm.
different kinds of of retirement accounts, right? You can have a 401, which is common. You can have what's called a SEP, which is a self-employment kind of a 401. You could have, so those are bank accounts with money in them. They're divided in half. The only protections that are in place in Michigan, and I think in most states, is if you've contributed before your marriage,
Mhm.
that portion of your retirement account would not be divided. That gets tricky though, because let's say you're married for 25 years, right? But you worked for Ford for 5 years before that, and you
Mhm.
accrued 15,000. Well, how much is that 15,000 worth 25 years later? It's
Yeah.
hard to figure it out. Okay, so that's tricky. There's also pensions, which
Mhm.
are not bank accounts, but it's called defined benefits, where it's like a monthly amount. It's much, much less common than it used to
Yeah.
be. But if the older people, let's say you've been employed by the same person for, or the same company, I mean, for a long time, we're seeing a lot of the defined pensions. And then again, you're going to get 50%. The
Mhm.
person who's not the worker is going to get 50% of their spouses. So
Yes, that is so much. Just kind of going back to what you were talking about, I think that is a headline for a lot of people with regard to Social Security. And if you're joining us and you're just hearing this for the first time, there's actually a post on my blog, Divorce and Social Security Benefits, a comprehensive guide. It's a good place to start. And as you said, Jorin, if you have been married to a high earner, or you haven't had an income and, only one person was bringing it in, you will be able to claim 50% of whatever their max is. And just remember, that doesn't affect the other person's Social
they
Security
don't
at
even
all. It
know.
has nothing to do with it. Yeah. And I think there's, a little bit of a fear. I don't want to overstep, but I do need to look, you guys need to be thinking about, the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years financially when you're preparing for this process. A lot of the clients I work with, when we're doing the financial planning, it's always with an eye of, how's this going to affect me in 5 months? 5 years, 15 years. You want to do that as you're preparing for negotiations to make sure that the numbers of your life are going to add up, or at least that you're going to have a plan for any kind of gap. And then when you were talking about the SEPA IRAs and the 401ks and the pension, something really important to remind people of, when you're negotiating splitting up your assets during a divorce, you have to understand that the value of a dollar in a retirement account is not equal to that of a dollar in a savings or a checking account. And why is that? And that's because of compound interest. It's about the growth of things. And Jordan, you said something so important, which is, if you had retirement accounts prior to your marriage, you need to deduct the amount that, let's say it was $15,000, as well as a projection of how much that would have made at this point. That is something that a CDFA can help you with. So that's one expert that can, and that's a certified divorce financial analyst. I do a lot of work with Joseph D. Cruz over at Cover Your Assets on this. And then the other person, Jorin, I believe that, most people, and this is somebody hired by your attorney or a mediator, if you go the mediation route, is somebody who does a quadro, right?
Right.
To get the, yeah.
They get the
And is
exact
that,
amount.
mm-hmm.
Mhm. One
When,
other thing when you're doing the quadro, which is something to make sure to put in your judgment, is called surviving spouse benefits. And now, that's something in Michigan, at least, you have to specifically say whether or not you are the surviving spouse. And what that means is if the it can get very complicated and you need a specialist who does quadros. But it's like if you're supposed to get 50%, well, what happens if your spouse dies? What happens if you die? Does it revert to the original owner of the 401? Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
You,
She's
I
a
thought I
she's a
saw.
working attorney, you guys.
I thought I blocked that. Anyway, but you have to make sure that you will, if you're supposed to get 50% and then you die early, it goes to your estate, does not revert back. This is part of a plan, and that's why you need an expert on the quadro.
Yeah.
The qualified domestic relations order. It's very important that you get an expert to make sure you're getting everything and that your judgment, depending on what state you live in, some states have laws maybe that help, but just in case, we put it into the judgment, you will remain the surviving, the beneficiary of your ex's pension, which also helps too if, they get remarried, then it kind of boxes out the next one.
Yeah, and what we're talking about that qualified domestic order with regard to retirement accounts that does get filed with the judgment. So just giving a little more information on the
Sure.
financial planning side. So what that means is when you're splitting those retirement accounts, since it's been filed with a judgment and stamped properly, then that quadro report is the thing that's going to be sent to the financial institution so that they understand what to release, why, and so that when you're transferring it, ideally, when you're rolling it over into your own retirement account, that way you will not be, kind of penalized with taxes on it. If you can just roll it over, please do, because again, that's going to give you that jump start on your retirement accounts. I
Let
want
me
to kind
just
of
say,
dive into.
well, I just want to just add to that if you are going to roll it over, but you need the money, that you make sure in your calculations, you're going to have to pay what they call ordinary income tax when you pull the money out. So $100,000 is going to be, if it's going to put you into the higher tax bracket for the year that you withdraw the money, you're going to be paying 30,000, 35,000 of taxes. And that can really bite you the next year, and you're going to owe on taxes if they don't withhold enough.
Yes.
So it's tricky, and it's something when you're doing the financial planning, like you said, it's not real dollars because it's pre-taxed dollars. So if you have to pull it, let's say to buy a house or something like that, you're going to have to pay tax on it, and you don't want to screw yourself and not consider that when you're doing your planning.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely such important advice. And for those of you who might be at this stage where you're either information gathering or you're about to have consultations with divorce attorneys and you're gathering up all of your asset information, which we're going to get into, retirement accounts are assets. As I said, you're going to want to project not only for today, but also for tomorrow. So you can also, I have another blog post, Rebuilding Your Financial Future After Divorce, and it's a decade by decade guide, just as you and I were just talking about, because when you're going through a split and you're 50 and above, it's like those financial considerations are different. If you've been out of the workforce, you haven't been able to put into retirement accounts, you haven't been building your income, right? So you're kind of a step behind, and all of that needs to be taken into consideration when you're negotiating your assets, as well as coming up with a plan to figure out, if I have a shortfall coming up, how can I supplement that? And that way you're taming those financial fears. I know firsthand how overwhelming it can seem. And many of my clients start in that same position. But Jorin, as we know, knowledge is power. So by doing the work, looking under the hood and preparing, especially in advance of your consultations, you're going to go into the process a lot more positioned to become your own best advocate, as opposed to get kind of turned over by the process and not know which way is up, because every decision you make has a direct effect on your future. When we're kind of going back to talking about assets and even complex assets together, like perhaps a family business or investment properties. We already covered pension plans. How do you untangle everything kind of equitably when you're kind of looking at that, 30 years down the line, and your spouse potentially owns, a business?
Right. It's very complicated, as you said, and complex. So assuming if you're getting divorced in your 50s, let's say you've been married at least 20 or 30 years, this is when it's very difficult to value the family business. Let's say, just use a family business as an example. So your spouse was in the family business and you are a stay-at-home parent raising the children. So now what is the value? What do you get in the family business? And that requires well, around here, what we get are accountants that value your spouse's interest in the family business. And it's a snapshot in time. So it will be, what is it valued at in 2025? Now, there's some arguments. If you're the business owner, you'll say, hey, I got it as a gift, or I worked there my whole life. I don't own any, or I just started owning it in the last 5 years, which if it's that kind of a business. There's all kinds of arguments as the business owner that you can try to make, that it was a gift, number one. If that's the case, then your spouse would only be entitled to the value of growth from the gift point forward. If marital assets were used to buy into any kind of business, then you have a better case as the non-owner spouse, that this is 100% marital, as opposed to just looking at the growth from purchase point to end point. Now, another way, you have to be careful not to get screwed. I don't know what the word, I don't know how to say a nice
Appropriate.
word. Yeah,
Appropriate.
okay. Is that here's this is the scariest part. You're the non-business owner. You don't know what special deals are going on at the business. You don't know if someone's going to be buying that business. I had a case, and the man made these hooks that go on the back of a truck, and they were very special. They fit on Ford trucks, F-150s. This is so specific, right? So let's say the value of the company was $1 million when we did the divorce. Well, guess what? 2 years later, this guy turned around, and it was so niche that Ford wanted this company so much. They didn't pay 2 million, which is, twice what she valued it at. No, they paid 20 million. And that's because, but who could have known that? So sometimes there's this term called clawback. That's one thing we use, which means you try to say, look, we're valuing it in 2025. But if you end up selling it in the next, depending on how long your marriage was, 3 to 5 years, 10 years, I'm going to get a portion of it above what we valued it at. So that's a tricky little clause. And hopefully, if you're at the point where you're valuing a company, you have enough resources to hire a real high level attorney that can help make sure you're getting everything that you're supposed to be getting.
Such helpful information. And yes, when you're talking about going into a divorce with a spouse who owns a business, it is multi-layered. And I would also say, if this divorce is something that is also going to be requiring spousal or child support, income's going to have to be figured out. And when you're looking at those business tax returns with Jorin or your attorney, you really want to look at what the deductions are, because there are a lot of legal tax deductions for a business that, again, while totally legal for tax purposes, do count towards income. So that's something that you really want to kind of dog ear and go through with a fine tooth comb. And, people sometimes they say, oh, you're too detailed. Why would you do this? Because you only do divorce once. Okay. The truth of the matter is, I'm always talking about the foundation of my coaching practices. There's an emotional side to divorce and there's a business side. You need to separate the two and address them both, because when you're going into the divorce process and you're hiring Jorin and you're moving forward, you are undoing a partnership contract. And if you don't have a prenup, then the terms of your contract are those of the state. So kind of having that awareness going in and treating it as such. This is an emotional, it's not supposed to be. Prepare yourself for negotiation, because money equals feelings all around. And what can feel really equitable to one person, or fair rather, can feel really unfair to the other person. And equity is always the name of the game. And Jorin, you and my other friends in the legal community always tell me that in divorce, fair is considered the F word.
That's funny.
Which I
Yeah.
love.
Well,
So Maggie Ruth dropped in. I'm just going to pop this question. Do you have any recommendations on how to find out for other countries. And this was with regard to if you had money in a retirement account prior to marriage, what's the best way to find that out? This is a UK based person, but I would say the same information applies, which is most financial institutions have records going back decades,
Well,
right? So you can
now
contact.
in the US, we only go back 7 years. They only have to legally keep the record 7 years.
Interesting. I would still say reach out only because I've had success with clients and personally going back in 20 years. Uh,
Oh,
you just never know. I guess it depends on the financial
oh,
institution because I had a question similar to that. So I'm
okay.
glad to know now moving forward, more industry standard is 7 years. Um, we kind of danced around this spousal support issue. So
Mhm.
let's say you have a couple divorcing, whether one person was working in the home or perhaps they were the lower earner in the dynamic. How much does being married for 20 plus years versus 10 years change, at least in Michigan, right? The spousal support conversation for your clients that are divorcing later in life.
Sure, it makes a huge difference. The way I think most states figure out spousal support, I mean, some states have an absolute formula. In Michigan, we do not. We look at factors, and one a huge factor is the length of marriage. So obviously, you're married 3 years. I, I can barely get spousal support unless it's a very big difference in the income. But if you're married 20 years and you've relied on a particular person for your, for your living expenses, it's much more powerful and much more important factor when you're calculating spousal support.
Such important information. And I think there's this old narrative that when we're talking about spousal support, this idea of if you've been in a long-term marriage that it's automatically locked in for life. That it all depends on the length of the marriage. So don't go into that assuming that you're going to be paying for the rest of your life or that you're going to be receiving. You really want to make sure, especially if you're receiving spousal support, again, check everything with your tax preparer to make sure, on the federal level, those who it was changed, I believe it was in
Yeah,
2018, 2019, where you're
18.
not 2018, where you're not paying income tax on the federal level for spousal support. You used to have to, so any marriage prior to that still does. And then make sure that on a state level, you're not looking at tax exposure because that varies state by state.
Oh, I
Again,
didn't
it's
know
one of
that.
the
Okay.
yeah, it's one of the expenses that you need to, look at. Like when you're projecting your budget post divorce, it's something I'm always working on clients with, right? Like, and you and I have talked about this a little bit. Health insurance can vary case by case. So if you're somebody who's really relied on your spouse's, work or business health insurance, please remember that you're going to need to investigate that as an additional expense that you're covering after divorce. I know we've blown by these 20-minute conversation and that you're an actual working attorney, but I have another, I just have one more question before
Sure.
wrapping it up. And that is, I think the other thing, divorce is a really great opportunity. You're laying the foundation for your life after divorce, first and foremost. So the more detailed you are during this process, the better off you're going to be in this new chapter, whether it's kind of projecting what your financial realities are, having access to all the information, statements and documents and your account information. But also like if you've had a will or a trust
Oh,
during your marriage, all of these things need to be set up now for your post divorce life. And most people don't realize, your estate plan needs immediate attention if you're going through a great divorce. What urgent changes should somebody make to protect themselves and their assets immediately after? Is that something that you ever counsel clients on?
well, they should definitely, no matter how old they are when they get the divorce, redo their estate planning. And if you have a joint trust with your spouse, it has to be dissolved. So it's an independent living document that is, I will have to say, usually there's a provision that it's automatically dissolved on divorce. But of course it depends on your particular trust. That would be my first stop after the courthouse, and would be to make sure that my estate plan appoints whoever you want to inherit from you and not your ex-spouse.
That's so important. Changing the beneficiaries. And if you have children, it's really important moving forward. If you, for some reason, did not have a will, this is the time at divorce to really put one in place to make sure that your assets are allocated the way that you want them to be. And it's very important. If you have a property, please consider a trust. I know it's a little bit of an upfront investment to work with an attorney who specializes in this kind of estate planning and such. But in the end, it's worth it because then you're not going to have things tied up in probate or go into the wrong hands. Jorin Rubin, this has been an insanely productive conversation on gray divorce. I can't thank you enough. And to everybody who joined us, I have one last question that I think is worth actually breaking in the wrap up. And Tina just dropped in, are veterans' disability benefits considered as income for spousal support?
Yes. It's income. All sources of income are considered for spousal support.
Oh, that is, thank you
In
for
Michigan, yeah.
yeah, exactly. You know, you're going to always want to check anything that you hear on social media, even when I'm talking to a trusted and very highly regarded divorce professional and attorney, Jorin Rubin today. Just make sure you double check everything with a local family law
Correct.
attorney. As we've stated, you know, laws vary state by state. So this is really, I love having these conversations because they're like little master classes in learning about the divorce process, how to prepare in advance of starting it. So you really, you know, you get yourself off on the best front foot. And with that, Jorin, I thank you so much for joining us
Pleasure.
today. And for everybody else who dropped in your questions and who've been listening so patiently, thank you so much. I'm Alex Beatty, divorce prep coach. Jorin, tips from a divorce attorney is going to be tagged in this immediately after. If you're in Michigan, I highly recommend you reach out to her if you're at this point in your marriage. And, you know, I think a lot of people would be really surprised that a good chunk of my clients who I work with one-on-one are at a point where they're not sure whether divorce is what's next. But by educating yourself and preparing for a consultation, no matter what happens, you're gonna be in a position where you know what to expect moving forward. Jorin, thank you so much. I hope to
Thank you.
talk to you again
All right.
in the summer.
Anytime.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye.